There is a word printed on bags of fertilizer sold across America. Biosolids. It sounds clean. It sounds scientific. Most people have never heard it, and that is exactly the point. Because behind that word is something you would almost certainly never agree to put on the food you feed your family. Here's the story they buried inside a word. Biosolids is treated human sewage. What arrives at a wastewater plant, everything flushed from millions of homes and drained from the factories upstream, gets separated into clean water and a thick, solid residue. That residue is sewage sludge. Once it is heated and treated to kill some of the bacteria, the industry stopped calling it sludge. In 1991, a trade group called the Water Environment Federation formally adopted a new word for it: biosolids. The reason was not scientific. It was public relations. Researchers who studied the campaign described it plainly. The new word was chosen to improve public acceptance of spreading the material on land. A peer-reviewed paper later called the renaming an example of the propaganda model of communication. So the substance never changed. Only the label did, and the label worked. Within a few years, the word biosolids was in dictionaries and in science textbooks. The thing most people would refuse if you described it honestly now had a name that asked no questions. Here is the part worth sitting with, and it starts at the storm drains and industrial pipes feeding the plant. Sewage is not only what comes out of homes. Whatever industry pours down the drain ends up in the same tanks. Solvents, metals, and chemical waste all settle into the same residue. When the water is cleaned and discharged, those contaminants stay behind, concentrated in the sludge. A friendly word does not make that safe. It only makes it easier to sell. And once the word existed, someone had to decide where all of it would go. Because America produces an enormous amount of this material, millions of dry tons of it every single year. The answer was farmland, American farmland. Not a small experiment at the edge of the system, but a national practice, encouraged and tracked by the federal government. More than half of the sewage sludge produced in the United States is now spread on land, according to the EPA. Much of that goes onto agricultural fields that grow food and animal feed. By one estimate, it has been used on roughly 1/5 of all American farmland. In 2023 alone, state reports filed with the EPA show that nearly 4.5 billion pounds of sludge were applied to farm fields or used in compost. Since 2016, the running total is around 19 billion pounds. The footprint is hard to picture, so here is the scale. Using industry surveys, the National Biosolids Data Project estimates that close to 70 million acres of American farmland may have had biosolids applied to it. That is roughly the size of Nevada, and that figure only counts one category of sludge. Another category requires no permit and no reporting at all, which means the true number could be higher, and nobody knows by how much. None of this is hidden in the legal sense. It is permitted. There is also a quiet economic engine behind it. Getting rid of sewage sludge is expensive, so the waste industry has every reason to find a destination that costs nothing. Repackaging it as fertilizer solves that problem. It is often free for the farmer, because waste companies pay to haul the material away, then give it to landowners at no cost. For a farm running on thin margins, free fertilizer rich in nitrogen and phosphorus is difficult to turn down. Almost any conventional farm is allowed to use it. The crops grown on that land are not labeled. The produce is not marked. It moves into the same supply chain as everything else on the shelf. So the practice is legal, federally tracked, and widespread. Which raises an obvious question. When the government approved this, What exactly did it check for? The approval has a name and a date. On February 19, 1993, the EPA finalized a regulation called Part 503, Standards for the Use or Disposal of Sewage Sludge. It was written under the Clean Water Act, and it is still the federal rule that governs spreading sludge on land today. Part 503 was not nothing. It set numerical limits for 9 heavy metals, including lead, arsenic, and mercury. It set rules to reduce bacteria and pathogens. It set management practices for how and where the material could be applied. But look closely at what that list contains. 9 metals. The regulations screened for the contaminants scientists were worried about in the late 1980s, based on a national sludge survey from that era. It did not screen for pharmaceuticals. It did not screen for flame retardants. It did not screen for industrial solvents. And it did not screen for a class of chemicals the public had barely heard of in 1993. The rule was supposed to be reviewed regularly for new pollutants. For the chemicals we are about to discuss, that review never produced a limit. That gap is not a loophole someone slipped through. It is simply what the rule was built to catch, and what it was not. The 1993 standard checked for 9 metals. It was never designed to catch what came next. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what those chemicals are. They're called PFAS, short for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are a family of thousands of synthetic chemicals invented to resist heat, water, and grease. They are in non-stick pans, waterproof jackets, fast food wrappers, stain-resistant carpet, and firefighting foam. Thousands of everyday products rely on them, and almost all of those products eventually wash, drain, or break down into the same wastewater system. The feature that made them useful is the same feature that makes them dangerous. The bond between carbon and fluorine is one of the strongest in all of chemistry, which means PFAS do not break down. Not in the soil, not in water, not in your body. That is why they earned a nickname: forever chemicals. Once they are inside you, they accumulate. Testing has found PFAS in the blood of almost every American, and the health record on these compounds is not reassuring. Research has linked PFAS exposure to certain cancers, to suppression of the immune system, to liver and kidney damage, and to developmental harm in infants. In drinking water, the level now considered safe is measured in parts per trillion. That is a few drops in an Olympic swimming pool. Here is how they reach your plate. Factories and households send PFAS down the drain. It flows to the wastewater plant. The treatment process pulls it out of the water, but it does not destroy it. It concentrates it into the sludge. The sludge is renamed biosolids and spread on a field. The chemicals bind to the soil, get pulled up by the crops, and are absorbed by the cattle that eat the feed. From there, they move into the milk, the beef, and the vegetables. This is not a theory. There is a farm where every step of it actually happened. His name is Fred Stone, a third-generation dairy farmer in Arundel, Maine. Working land his family had farmed for more than a century. For close to 20 years, he did what the system told him was responsible. He took the treated sludge and spread it across his fields as fertilizer. In 2016, a federal testing program traced high PFAS levels in the local water back toward his property. When the state tested further, the results were severe. The PFAS levels in his soil, his water, and his cows were extraordinarily high. His milk tested at around 7 times over the state's limit. Stone became the first farm in Maine to shut down because of PFAS contamination. He was forced to stop selling milk and to slaughter most of his herd. The land his family had worked for generations was poisoned by something he had been told was safe, under a word that promised it was. His case did not stay isolated. As Maine kept testing, the state found unsafe PFAS levels on more than 100 farms and at over 500 homes. Reporting later showed the state had been warned about toxic chemicals in sludge for more than 30 years before it acted. In 2022, Maine finally did something no other state had done. It became the first to ban the spreading of sludge on farmland outright. And Maine was not the only place this surfaced. Farmers in Michigan, Texas, and other states have reported the same pattern, with some forced to euthanize entire herds after PFAS turned up in their animals. One state banned the practice. The other 49 still allow it. And in 2025, the federal government finally looked at the question directly. January 2025, the EPA released a draft risk assessment on two of the most common PFAS chemicals found in sewage sludge. Its own modeling found that for families living on or near land treated with this material, the health risk in some scenarios exceeded the agency's own acceptable thresholds. The assessment was narrow on purpose. It looked at people most exposed, the farm families living on this land, rather than the general public who eat from many sources. But the finding still stands on its own terms. The EPA had approved spreading sludge in 1993. 32 years later, its own scientists flagged the danger. So what can you actually do with this? You do not need to be a chemist, and you do not need to grow your own food. A few concrete steps go a long way. First, you can check your own state. Several states publish maps or permit records showing where sludge has been approved for land application. Maine lists those sites in a public database, and other states keep similar records you can request. Second, the most reliable protection at the grocery store is the USDA organic label. The National Organic Program explicitly prohibits sewage sludge in any form. A certified organic farm cannot legally use biosolids, and the land has to be free of it for 3 years before an organic harvest. Here, organic is not a marketing word. It is a legal line. Outside of that label, there is no requirement to tell you whether the food you are buying was grown on treated sludge. Third, if you grow your own food, be careful what you buy. Some bagged compost and lawn products are made from biosolids, and they are not always clearly labeled as such. If you want certainty about your own soil, private laboratories will test it for PFAS, though that testing is not cheap. None of this requires panic. It requires knowing the word and knowing what it covers, which brings us back to where we started. For more than 30 years, treated human sewage has been spread across tens of millions of acres of American farmland, carrying chemicals that never break down, under a rule that was never designed to catch them. The most remarkable part is how ordinary it all looks. No one broke the law. The permits were filed. The science was published. The bags were labeled accurately, with a word that almost no one understood. That is what makes it work. A lie can be exposed. A euphemism just sits there, technically true, waiting for you to stop asking what it means. They didn't lie to you. They just renamed it. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, as this helps us make more videos like these in the future.